Alrighty then, we're about to begin. My name be Greybeard. I'm a privateer. I am the gunner of the privateer ship Broom here in the harbor during the American Revolutionary War. And today I am going to be talking to you about some history of Fort Phoenix, and we're going to have a great ceremony here. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to Fairhaven on behalf of the Office of Tourism, the Fairhaven Village Militia, the Select Board of the Town of Fairhaven, and the Town Administrator. Some of those folks are standing over here. Town Administrator is Angie Lopes-Ellison. That's Angie. Stacia Powers, Leon Corey, Bob Espindola, Keith Sylvia, and Charlie Murphy are the 5 members of our Select Board. Alrighty, this is going... Go down there. I shouldn't need that anymore. All right, then. We're gathered here on July 4th at Fort Phoenix, which played a role in the American Revolution. The activity here in Fairhaven actually started before we had a fort here. So the very first story I'm going to tell you is about something that happened before Fort Phoenix was ever here. As you probably know, the war began on April 19th, 1775, and that is the day that the Redcoats marched out of Boston toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. That's the day of the shot heard round the world. That's the day when Paul Revere and 2 other people who didn't have really good public relations in their family rode off into the countryside and warned everyone that the Redcoats were on the move. Our militia companies here in the village went to Boston following the battles of Lexington and Concord, and then they came back to the villages. Our militia, like our Fairhaven Village militia, were volunteers, people between the ages of 16 and 60 years old in good health were required to volunteer to defend our villages at the time of attack. And on Saturday mornings, usually these folks would gather in a field outside the village and they would muster. They would practice. They would practice their learning their commands. They would practice loading and firing their muskets. And less than a month after the battles of Lexington and Concord, less than a month, on May 13th, 1775, Nathaniel Pope, Daniel Eggery, and our militia company was out in the village field practicing when a horseback rider arrived and told them that there were 2 British ships that were anchored off our harbor. One was off the end of Sconticut Neck over there toward the east, and the other was on the end of Clark's Point to the west. And those 2 British ships were manned by Royal Marines, and they were going to harass any Americans who were sailing in and out of our harbor. So Nathaniel Pope and Daniel Eggery decided that they were going to sail out and do something about that. So at midnight, they gathered down at the waterfront, and Daniel Eggery had a sloop named the Success. The Success was big enough that 25 men could hide below the deck, but they had to draw straws to see which 25 would go and which 25 had to stay ashore. And they got on the boat and they swept out of the harbor during the darkness of night after midnight. Sweeping means rowing. There was no wind that day, and if you didn't have wind, you couldn't sail. So they had to row. All through the night, they rowed out toward the east, and as the sky started to get lighter gray in the morning, through the mist, they saw the first British ship anchored there. And there was a watchman on board, and he could see them coming, but he just saw a small sloop with 2 people on the deck. On the deck were Nathaniel Pope and the drummer boy, Benjamin Spooner, who was there to give signals. But as Nathaniel Pope and the Success got closer to the British ship, the British watchman on board asked them to sheer away. He wasn't concerned because it was a small boat. There were just 2 people on board. But he didn't want them to collide, and Nathaniel Pope was getting awfully close. So he said, "Sheer away!" That means turn. Why use one word when 2 can work, right? So sheer away! And Nathaniel Pope did not sheer. He was coming right up alongside. And as he got closer, the British watchman decided to load his musket. Well, Took a bit of time to load a musket back then. Before he could do that, Nathaniel Pope had pulled up alongside. He used a grappling hook to put the two boats together. He stomped his foot on the deck. Benjamin Spooner beat his drum, and our 25 men went aboard the British ship, grabbed that watchman, subdued him, went down below deck, and captured very easily about 14 Royal Marines who were completely taken by surprise. This was the best trained fighting force ever on Earth, really, at that time, but they had no idea they were about to be attacked. So with little ado, a little scuffling, we subdued those men, tied them up, left them below deck, closed the hatch cover, and dragged the anchor over it to keep them down there. And then Nathaniel Pope stayed on that ship, and Daniel Eggery started guiding the Success across to the other side, where the second British ship was anchored. Now they had seen something going on. The sun was coming up now. They had seen skirmishing, so they put up their sails, and they were sailing away, and we were pursuing them and firing shots at them. Now one thing that was happening was the commander of the British ship, he was somewhat of a coward. He was ducked down behind the hatchway, and he kept popping his head up like this to look around and to give commands to his men. And every time he popped his head up, he had this big white feather in his hat that was flying in the breeze like this, shining in the sunlight. And so Daniel Eggery pulled aside one of our riflemen, a fellow by the name of Mr. Shockley, and he said, "Mr. Shockley, the next time you see that feather pop up, I want you to take a shot at it." So Mr. Shockley got ready. A moment or two later, the British commander popped up his head, and pow! The bullet hit him in the side of the scalp, and it slid around under his scalp and popped out the back. He survived. When we got him to the village doctor later that morning, he joked that his family was known for its thick skulls. Probably saved his life that day. But when he was injured, his men surrendered. They put up the flag of surrender. We took over that second ship. And so on Sunday morning, May 14th, 1775, Nathaniel Pope, Daniel Eggery, and the Success came in with 2 captured ships and about 25 captured British Royal Marines. And that was, in fact, the very first naval battle of the American Revolution. And it was fought right here by Fairhaven village men, and we won! Huzzah! But it was around that time that they decided that they should build a fort. Now, this was all the town of Dartmouth during the Revolution, but there were villages here on the Acushnet River, and here on our side of the river there was Fairhaven Village, there was Oxford Village. On the other side of the harbor was Bedford Village, and way up 3.5 miles from here was Acushnet Village, or Head of the River Village. And all 4 of those villages were north of this rocky point here. So it was decided to build a fortification here to defend against the British sailing up and attacking those 4 villages. So they built a fort here, and there were 11 small cannon, like that one right there, that were pointing out. And there were 34 or so men who were stationed in here. And originally this fort did not have a name. This place was known as Nolscott Point. Nolscott's an old Native American word that means Nolscott. And so the fort was here, the fort at Nolscott Point, and that was the beginning of the war. Now let's skip ahead to why we're celebrating today. In July of 1776, it was a year later. The fort wasn't even completed at that time here. It took about 2 years to build the fort. But on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted on a resolution to claim that the 13 colonies were free and independent states. They were the United States of America. That was July 2nd, and then Thomas Jefferson and his crew put together the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July 4th, which we now celebrate as Independence Day. And a lot of people think, well, that was the end of the war. That's why we celebrate. It's the 4th of July, Declaration of Independence, ta-da! The Declaration was really kind of close to the beginning of the war. And it went on for many years after that. And we're going to talk to you in a little while about what happened later. But first, we have the chairperson of the Select Board, Stacia Powers, and she is going to read to you the Declaration of Independence. Do you want this in your hand?
In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariable the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Thank you, Stacia. But the war went on. The war went on and on. Now, the war went on in 76, 77, 78, 79. The Revolutionary War did not end until 1783. And as I told you before, I am a privateer privateering was going on in this harbor. Privateers were private boat owners who were given permission to put weapons on their ships and sail out and capture enemy vessels. They could then bring the ships back in, auction them off with all the goods that were aboard them, and split the proceeds between the crew. So privateering was a very important part of the American Revolution because we didn't really have much of a navy at all. During the entire Revolutionary War, many times more British ships were captured by privateers than by our navy. So here on this harbor, many privateer ships sailed out in 1775, 1776, 1777. Finally, in 1778, the British were getting really angry with us. They called this harbor a hornet's nest of privateers. And so on Saturday, September 5th, 1778, 36 British transport ships sailed around Clark's Point, and on the Bedford side of the harbor, they landed about 4,000 soldiers. Now, in the entire township of Dartmouth at that time, we only had about 2,100 adults, and here the British were landing 4,000 soldiers. They marched up the road. They marched up what was then called King's Road. We changed that name pretty quick. They got to where County and Union Street are today. They shot and killed a couple of our people there. Then they swept down to the harbor. They were setting buildings on fire, setting warehouses, setting many ships on fire. The ships burnt the ropes that were tying them to the wharfs and were drifting across the harbor in flames and sinking. Here on our side of the harbor, the people could see that going on across the way, and so people started gathering up their household belongings and trying to escape. The women gathered together the children and things that they felt were most valuable. Some women wrapped up stuff in their sheets and dropped them down in the wells, so if the British got to their house, they wouldn't find their most valuable possessions. And then they went off through the woods into Acushnet and Rochester. And all that Saturday, the British troops marched up toward head of the river. Now today there's a place called the River's End Cafe, which none of you have ever been to, so you don't know where that is. River's End Cafe, there's a little stone bridge there now. Well, during the Revolutionary days, there was a wooden bridge there, and that was the only way across the river back then. There was no New Bedford Fairhaven Bridge, no Coggeshall Street Bridge, no 195, no Slocum Street Bridge. The only way to get across the river was that little wooden bridge, and there, the British arrived at about midnight. There was a bloody battle there. One of our men by the name of Jonathan Metcalf was shot and killed. He's buried today in Acushnet Cemetery. And the British got over to our side of the harbor, and they settled down for the night. Now we're going to leave them up there for a moment and go back earlier in the afternoon and tell you what was going on here. Now we had here 34 Minutemen, 34 militiamen under the command of Timothy Ingraham. And we had 11 little cannon pointing out that way, but they couldn't fire very far. So when the British landed their troops on Clark's Point, that was out of the range of these cannon. We didn't have any defense this way because that was us. That's the good guys. We don't need anything over there. Well, what the British did was they sailed one ship around to the east of us, and down where the state beach is today, they landed about 250 soldiers who started marching in toward the fort on the land side. So, here we were. 34 brave American militiamen facing about 250 of the best trained soldiers in the world. So what do you think we did? Run away, run away, run away. Yes, that's exactly what we did. We knew that we couldn't hold up against them, so we fired one volley of shot at us. Our men scattered on the way to the village and got out of here. The British came in here and they destroyed all of the cannons except one. That one survived. They brought in sledgehammers, and they cracked the barrels. If you crack the barrel of a cast iron gun, it can't fire anymore. But that one managed to survive. We mounted it again. It was used during the War of 1812, and it is still here at Fort Phoenix. That is an original gun that's been here ever since the Revolutionary War. But they destroyed the fort. They got back to their ship, and they sailed over to Sconticut Neck. Now, the big group of ships that had dropped off people on the Bedford side also sailed over to Sconticut Neck. The plan was you march up the west shore of the Acushnet River on Saturday, and then on Sunday they were going to sweep down through the Fairhaven side. Now let's go to Sunday morning. It's Sunday morning and you have all of those British soldiers up at Acushnet village. They're all very, very hungry. So they started looting and breaking into people's houses looking for food. I have to tell you something about food during the colonial days. This was now a Sunday. Sunday was very, very strictly upheld as the Sabbath, and you could not work on Sundays. You couldn't open shops, you couldn't work in your garden, and cooking was considered work, so women were not allowed to cook on Sundays. What they would do is on Saturdays, they would make a whole lot of extra food, usually big, big pots of baked beans. And they would put the baked beans down in the cellar near the chimney fire, and they would have them on Sunday so that they could just scoop them out. Well, the British started breaking into their houses and stealing people's food, stealing their baked beans. They got into Doc Toby's house up in the village, and they opened the cellar door to go down and get the beans. They closed over the closet door where the Tobys had held much of their valuables hidden away, and they missed the valuables, but they did get the baked beans. So that morning, you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of British soldiers eating lots and lots and lots of baked beans. Later on that morning, you could hear them coming. You could hear their boots on the ground. That's what you were thinking. And they were setting houses on fire very carefully. There was a lot of gas in the air that morning. And finally, they got to Bartholomew West's house. Now, Bartholomew West lived in a house right near where Oxford School is today. And he was the grandson of the Pilgrim John Cook. Bartholomew West was 88 years old in September of 1778. And he had a Wampanoag woman named Hannah Sogg as his servant. And when the British came and they were going to burn down your house, they were kind of polite about it. They'd knock on the door. They'd say, "Hello, we're going to burn your house down. You might want to get out." So they got to Bartholomew West's house. They pounded on the door. Well, Hannah answered the door because her master was 88 years old. He was sick in bed. And they said, "Get out, get out. We're going to burn your house down." They said it with an English accent, so it probably sounded more polite than that. And Hannah said, "My master is 88 years old. He's sick in bed. Will some of you help me carry him out?" And they looked at her, this servant woman, this Wampanoag servant woman, and they said, "Madam, we are not your servant." Well, Hannah mustered up all her strength, and she went over to the old man, and she scooped him out of bed, and all by herself, she carried Bartholomew out of the house, and brought him to a tree in the backyard, and there they sat and watched while the British burnt the house down. And Bartholomew was very upset, but more than the loss of his house was the loss of the family Bible. The family Bibles, every family had one. It was a very important book, not just for religious reasons, but because all of the family history was written down in the front pages of the family Bible. They would record special dates, like when couples were married, when babies were born, not always in that order. And even news like the winter when it was so cold that the river froze and you could ride a horse over from Bedford Village. All of that information was written in the front of the Bible. And Bartholomew thought that the British had burnt his family Bible. They hadn't, though. They had taken it. And they carried that Bible with them all throughout the war and returned to England with it. And today, in 2022, in the town of Bodmin, England, in the clubrooms of the 46th Regiment of Foot, there is Bartholomew West's family Bible in a glass case, and they still won't give it back. And we know people who have tried. We know members of the public who are direct descendants of Bartholomew West, and they've tried over the years. They've written every politician on both sides of the Atlantic trying to get that Bible back, not for themselves, but for the town, for the history. And the British will not let it go. But it's there in Bodmin, England, and you can all go and visit it. And if a bunch of you all went together, you could maybe start a little distraction. And I'm not advocating thievery, though, because A, I'm a town official and my boss is right there, and B, it would be return of stolen property, so it would be okay, you know. Alrighty, so the British, they burnt Bartholomew's house. They went to Bartholomew Tabor's house. He stood up against them because he noticed that the commander who came to his door and said, "Get out, I'm going to shoot you," he didn't have a flint in his gun. And you can't fire a gun without a flint in it. So he knew that he was safe and he stood his ground. But the British commander stole his best gold shoe buckles, and he had to use his second best silver buckles after then. They got to Alden Road, the end of Alden Road where John Alden's house was. They stole a couple of oxen. They drove those oxen ahead of them to Scoticut Neck, and there at the beach where the fleet was anchored offshore, they slaughtered the oxen, and they had a big barbecue there. And then they got back on their ships. The plan was then to sail away from here to the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. It was Labor Day weekend. They wanted to go to the islands. But there was no wind, and they didn't have engines back then. So when there was no wind, you couldn't go anywhere. So the British were stuck there, all of these men on board their boats, and some of them were getting kind of bored and eager to do something. So they got into some rowboats and they rowed around here where they'd already destroyed the fort the day before, and they landed at Fairhaven Village to try to stir up some more trouble and do some looting and damage there. Lucky for us, our ragtag militia group was kind of reinforced at that point. Our men, you know, we were volunteers, we were shopkeepers, we were farmers, we had no idea when we got into this that we were going to be fighting the best trained soldiers in the entire world. Some of our men went and hid off in the woods. But Major Israel Fearing heard that we were under attack because we sent people out on horseback into the countryside, just like Paul Revere had done years before. And they warned everybody that the British were attacking. And they got to Wareham, and Major Israel Fearing had about 250 militiamen. So all day Saturday, he marched with his men, and finally by Sunday, they had arrived at the village. And he gathered together the remains of our militia company, and he lined everybody up, and they say he gave us a very inspirational speech. He pulled out his pistol. He said, "I'm going to shoot the first one of you who tries to retreat." And that was the inspiration we needed. So we hid behind buildings and barrels and boxes and trees, and as the British came ashore, we fired shots at them, and they didn't know how few people we really had. And so they got back in their rowboats, and then they went back to Scoticut Neck, and finally on Monday, September 7th, 1778, they sailed out of here bound for Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. They were really going there to gather sheep for food. Nantucket and the Elizabeth Islands and Martha's Vineyard didn't have good soil for growing crops, but they could grow grass. So many, many flocks of sheep were raised on the islands, and they provided us with our food here, with mutton and lamb, and with wool for our clothing. So the British left here, and they rounded up a whole bunch of sheep to feed the troops. And that raid in 1778 more or less put our harbor out of commission until the very end of the Revolution. We did not get going again. The first large ship to sail out of here did not do so until 1783, just as the war ended. And we did rebuild this fort, though. And that is where the name Fort Phoenix comes from. The phoenix is a mythical bird that rises from the ashes. And so we named this after that mythical bird, Fort Phoenix. And that's where we are today on the 4th of July to celebrate our independence. That's the boring stuff. Alrighty. Now we are going to have the singing of the national anthem. We're going to have the raising of the American flag, and that will be followed by a small gun salute by the Marine Corps League. So I'm going to invite up our singer. Our singer is Acushnet resident and Fairhaven High School graduate Tori Kalis, who is the current Miss Freetown, and then she is accompanied by a couple of other Miss New Bedford teen and Miss Freetown teen. You can come and stand on either side if you want, or you can just stand there. Okay, they're being told to go up there. Tori is going to get the microphone. Now, raising our flag for us this morning, we have Cassie and Lacey Freitas, the daughters of the late Selectman Dan Freitas. They are the ones raising our flag. And then we will have the Marine Corps League give a gun salute. And there'll be more after that. Here you go.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Order, arm. Stand easy.
Alrighty now, here's the part you really came for. Right now, under the command of Commander, he's the commander, so they're under his command, Wayne Oliveira, the Fairhaven Village Militia is going to be loading and firing the 5 cannons that we have here. Now, these are Civil War cannons. They were not here during the Revolution. They came in 1861 at the beginning of the Civil War, and they have been here ever since. So here at the fort, we have a Revolutionary War cannon. We've got these 2 from the War of 1812, and we have 5 cannon from the Civil War. During all 3 of those wars, this was an active military fort. So Fort Phoenix was a real fort, and it did protect our harbor through 3 wars. The militia is going to begin by step-by-step loading cannon number 1, and I will describe what they're doing. That way, if you ever want to do this on your own, you can do that. Oh, I should mention, too, that several of us are licensed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to fire cannons. You can get a cannon and mortar firing license, and you do require one. So Wayne's licensed too. Ready, Wayne.
Militia, we're going to prepare to fire.
Clear the vent. The first thing he's doing is he's taking a brass pick and he's clearing the touch hole at the back end of the gun. Stop vent. He puts his thumb over it so that no sparks get in there too early and set off a charge. Worm the cannon. The cannon worm is a rounded, looks like a big spring on the end of a stick, and that's used to clean out the barrel and make sure there's no residue in there before you fire. Now, during battles, you would be firing one shot after another, and you might have burning embers of the previous gunpowder in there. You want to clean that out before you put in more gunpowder, or else things go boom too early. Wet sponge. They use a sponge made of sheepskin dipped in water, and that puts out, again, any burning embers that might be in the barrel, cleaning it out. Dry sponge is to dry out the barrel. There's a damp sponge in between sometimes.
Dry sponge. Bring the charge.
Bring the charge. The powder monkey brings up the gunpowder charge. Now, normally that would be a big linen bag of gunpowder. And when these guns were first used, they would have 10 pounds of gunpowder to fire a 24-pound cannonball. So they're loading in the gunpowder charge, which is considerably smaller than 10 pounds right now. Ram the charge. He's pushing that gunpowder charge all the way back so it is underneath the touch hole. So the gunpowder now is right under the touch hole in the back of the cannon. Pick the charge. We skipped a step there, in case you noticed. We didn't load the cannonball. There's a boat coming in. Prime the charge. He's putting the quill. The quill was a hollow bird's feather filled with gunpowder, and that is put down inside the touch hole, and it's now ready to set up. Now, you have to do this all in advance. We're ready to fire. Firing cannon number 1 is going to be Stacia Powers. How about that? They're going to light the match. Now, the match is made out of a piece of cotton rope, and that has been soaked in saltpeter. Saltpeter is a chemical that will make that rope burn with a red-hot ember in the end, and it won't go out. So if it were windy, if it were rainy, and you were trying to fire the cannons, this match doesn't go out in the rain. Saltpeter is one of the components of gunpowder. I'll mention at this time, while we're getting that lighted, that there is a nationwide shortage of gunpowder. And Wayne and the militia had to scrounge up some gunpowder for today. The only North American country the only North American company that was still making gunpowder, the Goex company, which had been around since about 1812, closed last fall. And so all gunpowder has to be, right at this point, imported from Europe. It was backlogged. The orders were impossible to get filled. And so it was pretty tricky getting our gunpowder to fire the gun. Now we're lighting the match there. There is good news for the Goex company after going out of business. The Estes company, any of you fire those model rockets that have the dry cartridge that shoots them up in the air? That's the Estes company. They bought the Goex powder company, and they're going to start manufacturing black powder back in the United States. Black powder, by the way, is made from 3 pretty common ingredients, which I'm not going to tell you. We didn't make our own today.
Prepare to fire number 1. Fire.
The enemy's coming in very slowly. Surprise! Cannon number 2, Leon Corey. We're going to have a race. Okay, let's time this.
Prepare to fire number 2. Fire!
Okay, so far Leon's ahead.
It scared me though. I jumped. You didn't see me jump every time. I did jump. It's safe? No, that's what I'm doing.
Prepare to fire number 3.
Number 3, it's Selectman Robert Espindola.
Fire!
That didn't scare me.
That was a close call. I think Bob and Leon tied for speed.
Yeah, and then 4?
Keith, number 4.
Keith Sylvia is going to fire number 4. And then there's going to be a fight about who fires number 5.
Prepare to fire number 4. Fire!
One thing I want to mention to you about number 5. First of all, cannon number 5 has a plaque on it now that's dedicated in memory of Ellie Silveria, who was the longtime commander of the Fairhaven Village Militia. He died in 2000, and cannon 5 was his favorite cannon. One of the interesting things about cannon 5 is that when the sound gets to the other side of the harbor, it bounces off the buildings there, and you have an echo come back, so you kind of hear it once and then twice. And it looks like Charlie Murphy, so we have had all 5 of our new 5-person board, select board firing our cannon. So Charlie Murphy's doing number 5.
5 and fire!
I jumped a little.
Huzzah! And that's it. So I'd like to once again thank you all for coming and celebrating Independence Day, the 4th of July, with us here in the town of Fairhaven on behalf of the Select Board, the Town Administrator, the Fairhaven Village Militia, and the Fairhaven Office of Tourism. Have a good, safe rest of your holiday.